Margot Doyle was 40 years old, and for the last 14 months, she had worked double shifts at 2 different hospitals to keep her husband alive, and then to keep him solvent once he was. She drove a dented Honda with 190,000 miles on it. She packed leftover cafeteria food into the same plastic container every night and reheated it at midnight between shifts. Her co-workers called her the machine because in 14 months she had never once called out, never once been late, never once let anyone see how tired she actually was underneath the scrubs. That Tuesday, she came home from a 16-hour shift, still in her sneakers, and found Andre standing in the kitchen in a new haircut and a suit she didn't recognize, a folder of paperwork already laid out on the counter like he'd rehearsed the moment. He told her he'd been thinking, now that he was healthy again, that he needed someone who matched where his life was actually headed. He told her, gently, like he thought gentleness made it kinder, that he had met someone who understood that better than she ever could. $92,000 in medical debt had gone through Margot's overtime checks in 14 months. Every dollar of it, alone. What Andre never bothered to ask, not once in all that time, was where the rest of her overtime actually went after the hospital bills cleared, or whose name was quietly listed on the deed to the little brick building on Sycamore Street that had been paying her more every month than either of his 2 jobs combined. He believed he was trading up. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually walking away from, or how quickly the life he thought he was stepping into would come apart the moment it stopped being able to lean on her. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 14 months before that Tuesday, the morning after Andre's surgery had started the way most of Margot's mornings started that year, before dawn, the hospital hallway still quiet. A paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in her hand while she waited for the surgeon to come find her. Her grandfather used to say, "Buy something solid while everyone else is buying something shiny. Solid still stands when shiny falls apart." Cornelius Doyle had raised her after her mother passed young, working the loading dock at a produce warehouse for 31 years, and putting every spare dollar into a rundown 4-unit building on Sycamore Street that he fixed up himself on weekends. One apartment at a time. Over the better part of a decade, he'd left her that building outright when he died 6 years earlier, along with one piece of advice she'd never forgotten. Don't ever let anybody know exactly how deep your well goes. Let them assume you're carrying a bucket. Only refill it when nobody's watching. She had met Andre at a mutual friend's cookout, back when he was 34 and full of plans, the kind of man who talked about the future so confidently that people around him started believing in it too. He asked what she did. She told him she was a nurse, and that she also managed a little rental property her grandfather left her. Nothing major. He said that was sweet, and the way people say things are sweet when they've already decided it isn't very interesting, and then spent the next 20 minutes telling her about a consulting venture he was certain was about to take off. She'd found that certainty attractive at the time, the way people sometimes mistake momentum for substance. She married him 3 years later in her grandfather's backyard, under the pecan tree Cornelius had planted the year she was born. Walter, her grandfather's brother, had given the toast that day. Something about how the Doyle family had a habit of marrying people who talked a good game and hoping the game turned out to be real. Everyone had laughed. Nobody, including Margot, had taken it as a warning. That morning in the hospital corridor, the surgeon had come out and told her the bypass had gone well, that Andre would need months of recovery, physical therapy, follow-up procedures, medication most insurance plans wouldn't fully cover. She had nodded, thanked him, and by that afternoon had already picked up an extra shift at the second hospital across town, the one that paid better for nights. because Cornelius had also taught her that panic was a luxury for people who hadn't already made a plan. She never once touched the rental income to cover any of it. She paid every hospital bill in cash from her own overtime, month after month, and let the Sycamore Street money keep quietly compounding in an account only her accountant and her grandfather's old attorney knew the full shape of. Andre had never asked how the mortgage stayed current on a nurse's overtime alone. She had never explained past the surface of it. She was watching, even then, the particular way he started talking about his physical therapist, a woman named Priscilla, who ran the recovery gym down the street from the second hospital, in a tone that had a little too much detail in it for someone he only saw twice a week. 3 months into his recovery, a text preview lit up his phone on the nightstand while he slept off a physical therapy session. Priscilla's name at the top of it. A message that read, in part, about how much better things would be once he was fully back to himself. Margot read it once, standing very still in the dark, and didn't wake him to ask what it meant. Some things, her grandfather used to say, you don't ask about out loud. You just start keeping records. 11 months passed the way months do when a person is choosing to keep working instead of looking too closely at what's already in front of her. Then came the Tuesday she'd already told you about, the new suit. The folder on the counter. Andre explaining, almost kindly, that he'd found someone who matched where he thought he was headed now. What she hadn't said yet, what she barely let herself think in full sentences, was that some steady, unsurprised part of her had already started building a file the night that text lit up his phone. 8 months before he ever said a single word of it out loud. She did not argue with Andre in the kitchen. She did not raise her voice. She looked at the folder he'd prepared, thanked him for saving her the trouble of typing it up herself, and went to change out of her scrubs, because her grandfather had also taught her that dignity costs nothing and buys everything. That night, after Andre left to stay with a friend, just for a few days to give her space, she sat down with her laptop at the kitchen table and began, calmly, to look. Her hands didn't shake. She started with the shared bank statements first, the ones she'd been the only one actually reading for over a year. Buried among the medical payments were smaller, recurring charges she'd assumed were his physical therapy copays, a florist near the recovery gym, a dinner reservation app, a spa package billed to a rewards account under a name she didn't recognize. 8 months of these, roughly $6,400 total, small enough each time to slip past someone who wasn't already looking, large enough altogether to tell a very clear story. He had no idea, sitting in his recovery sessions twice a week, how carefully a woman who read lab values and vital signs for a living could also read a bank statement. Her face remained perfectly calm reading the totals. She printed every page anyway. She found the messages next, on a tablet he'd left logged in months earlier and never thought to check again. Priscilla's name saved simply as P. 10 months of conversation that started as physical therapy small talk and turned gradually into something else entirely. One message. From 4 months back, read. You're going to be a completely different man once you're through this. I can already see it. Another, more recent read. She's done her part. Let her be proud of that. You don't owe her the rest of your life for it. That last line she read twice. Over the following days, without raising her voice to a single person, she built the full timeline. 10 months of a relationship that had started while she was still driving him to follow up appointments and picking up his prescriptions on her lunch breaks. $6,400 in small charges she'd unknowingly helped fund by keeping their joint account current, while he quietly spent from it. She laid it all out on a single spreadsheet, the way she once charted vitals on a shift report, every entry timestamped, every total checked twice before she trusted it. A pattern that, laid end to end, looked less like a man falling for someone new and more like a man who had simply decided, the moment he no longer needed rescuing, that the person who rescued him wasn't worth keeping around. You didn't need a nursing degree to recognize when a patient's recovery and someone else's agenda had quietly become the exact same thing. She thought about her grandfather then, the two of them on ladders together one summer, him teaching her to check a foundation before she ever bothered painting a wall over it. Some structures, he used to say, look perfectly fine right up until the day somebody actually tests them. She opened a folder on her laptop. She named it simply Andre. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she knew would help her handle the rest of this exactly right. 3 days later, she sat across from an attorney named Corinne Beaumont in a small office above a dry cleaner. A woman who had built her practice on cases exactly like this one, where the husband assumed a tired, overworked wife wouldn't have the energy left to fight back. Corinne reviewed the folder without a single flinch, turning each page slowly, the way a person reads something they've seen the shape of plenty of times before. "You've been carrying all of this by yourself," Corinne said. Not quite a question. "Somebody had to keep the book straight," Margot said. "I just hadn't turned that skill on him yet." "Good," Corinne said. "Because he's about to learn that the woman who paid off his surgery also happens to be very, very good at documentation. Give me a week to pull everything on the trust before we respond to anything his attorney sends." "Take 2 if you need it," Margot said. "I've waited 14 months. I can wait 1 more week." Corinne's line landed simply. Exhaustion was not the same thing as weakness, and he was about to learn the difference the hard way. That weekend, Margot drove out to see her great-uncle Walter, her grandfather's younger brother, 82 now, still sharp, the last living person who remembered exactly how hard Cornelius had worked to buy that building in the first place. She told him everything on his porch, start to finish, the way her grandfather always wanted things told, plainly, without dressing anything up. Walter was quiet a long moment after she finished. Cornelius always said the day would come when somebody tried to take what he built without knowing anything about the work that went into it, Walter finally said. He set that trust up specifically so nobody could ever force a sale, not in a divorce, not in anything. Man could see around corners, your grandfather. "I know," Margot said. "I just didn't think I'd need it this soon." "Nobody ever does," Walter said. "That's why he built it early. You think I'm being too hard on him?" Margot asked. 14 months is a long time to just walk away from without saying anything at all. "I think you carried a man on your back for over a year," Walter said. "You don't owe anybody quiet gratitude for setting the weight down once he could stand up and leave on his own 2 feet. Real protection," he told her before she left, "was always put in place long before anybody needed it, by somebody who loved you enough to think that far ahead." Back home, Margot's accountant, a meticulous man named Desmond, who had managed the Sycamore Street books since Cornelius was still alive to sign the checks himself, confirmed what the trust documents already promised. The building was entirely separate property, held in a trust established a decade before her marriage, untouched by any joint account, immune to any claim Andre's attorney might try to make. Desmond also found, almost as an afterthought, that Andre had recently asked a coworker for the contact information of a divorce attorney who handled property disputes, 3 weeks before he'd said a single word to Margot about leaving. He hadn't just been planning an exit, he had been quietly checking whether he could take a piece of the one thing that had actually kept them both afloat. That following Sunday, Andre came by to collect the rest of his things, still cordial, still convinced the whole arrangement would go smoothly. Margot made him coffee out of habit. She asked how Priscilla's gym was doing this quarter. He told her, easily, that business was finally taking off, better than he expected. She was watching. She handed him his box of belongings and said nothing at all about the folders sitting in Corinne's office, or the trust documents Desmond had already pulled, or the calendar reminder for a settlement meeting the following week that his own attorney had requested, hoping for something quiet, fast, and cheap. The settlement meeting was held in a small conference room above the courthouse annex, a table too big for the 6 chairs around it, water glasses nobody touched, a wall clock ticking loud enough that Margot noticed it the second she walked in. Andre arrived first with his attorney, relaxed, clearly expecting a modest, uncomplicated split. He had not expected Priscilla to be waiting in the hallway when he walked in, invited at Margot's request, as a courtesy nobody had asked for, but everyone would end up needing. He had definitely not expected Great Uncle Walter to be seated quietly in the corner chair, upright, unhurried, exactly the way Cornelius used to sit through a room full of people who thought they knew more than they did. And he had not expected Margot to walk in last, unhurried, holding a folder that looked far too thin for everything it actually contained. He had no idea, sitting down so at ease, exactly how much ground had already shifted underneath him. Corinne opened without raising her voice, laying documents across the table one at a time, evenly spaced. The way someone sets a table for a meal the other side wasn't going to finish. The $92,000 in surgery debt Margot had paid alone. The $6,400 in charges quietly funneled toward Priscilla over 10 months. The message that read, "She's done her part. Let her be proud of that." Andre's face moved through its stages the way a heart monitor moves through an arrhythmia, steady at first, then a flutter of concern then, as Corinne set down the final page, a full and undeniable change in rhythm. That final page was the one Walter had asked to explain himself. "The Sycamore Street building has been in an irrevocable trust for 10 years, Walter said, evenly. Cornelius set it up long before this marriage ever started, specifically so nobody could ever touch it in a divorce. Margot's income from that property was never marital income. It never will be. You spent 14 months assuming your wife was barely keeping her head above water on overtime alone, and you never once asked how she was actually managing it." He let that sit a moment. "You don't get credit for guessing wrong that confidently," Walter added. Priscilla, who had been quiet in the doorway until then, looked at Andre with an expression that had far less to do with heartbreak than it did with arithmetic. "You told me you had savings," she said quietly. "You told me the surgery debt was almost gone and you were finally free to build something new." Andre opened his mouth and closed it again. "That's what I thought," Priscilla said, and didn't look at him again for the rest of the meeting. Andre tried, in the little room he had left, to reach for something softer. He said none of this was supposed to get this complicated, that he still respected everything she'd done for him, that surely 14 months of sacrifice on her part meant something between them still. "It meant everything," Margot said, unhurried, folding her hands on the table. "That's exactly why I'm not giving you any more of it. You decided I wasn't good enough for the life you wanted the moment you stopped needing me to save it. That decision belongs to you now, not me." She stood. She closed the folder that had already done all the work it needed to do. She did not look at Priscilla. She nodded once toward Walter on her way past, and the two of them walked out together, leaving the room behind them full of paperwork that mapped, in exact and undeniable detail, exactly how much of Andre's second chance had actually belonged to someone else the entire time. 9 months later, the little brick building on Sycamore Street had a 5th unit now, a converted storage space Margot had finally gotten around to renovating herself on weekends, the same way her grandfather once had. One wall at a time, unhurried, unwilling to rush a single piece of it. She'd kept his old level, the one with the bubble slightly off-center that he swore still read true, and used it on every wall she squared. She had cut back to a single hospital that year, days only, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and used the extra hours to finish a certification she'd been putting off for a decade, one that qualified her to run the hospital's new outpatient recovery unit, a promotion that came with a title and a salary that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Her supervisor told her at the ceremony that she'd never once seen anyone work as hard as Margot had that year, without a single complaint. Margot had simply said that complaining had never once paid a bill. She had started seeing someone that spring, unhurried, the way she did most things. Desmond's business partner, a quiet contractor named Isaiah, had come by to help her price out the 5th unit's renovation and stayed afterward to help her carry lumber she hadn't asked him to carry. He asked good questions and then actually waited for the whole answer. He never once mentioned what she did for a living like it needed improving, and when she told him about the building, about Cornelius, about the trust, he'd simply nodded and asked what her grandfather had been like. Which was, she realized later, the first time anyone had ever asked her that, instead of asking what the property was worth. Andre's recovery gym partnership with Priscilla did not survive the year. Without the financial cushion he'd assumed would still be there, and without ever having built any savings of his own during his marriage, he moved into a small apartment across town and picked up a second job to cover it. The same kind of double-shift life he had once found beneath the woman who'd actually lived it for 14 months so he could survive. Priscilla's gym lost its lease by winter after a slow year of overextended expansion. She and Andre stopped speaking not long after that. Word reached Margot, through a mutual acquaintance, that Andre had started telling people the divorce had cost him everything. A version of the story that conveniently left out exactly whose 14 months had paid for the life he'd been so eager to leave behind. Margot heard about most of it secondhand, through Walter, the way a person hears news from a life she'd already fully closed the door on. She registered it. She did not linger on it. That evening, out on the building's little back stoop with Isaiah, watching the light fade over the row of newly painted shutters, she thought about her grandfather's line, the one about solid things still standing long after the shiny ones had fallen apart. She was steady. She was solvent. She had spent 14 months keeping someone else alive and had never once, in all of it, forgotten how to keep herself standing too. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.